to cater to the slows. Shout out to W360. The commitment to the slows is just throwing money down the drain. Opening up the window, taking a duffel bag of cash, and just throwing it out the window of a moving car. That's what they're doing with their resources. You look at Asia Wilson's signature shoe, her logo, resources wasted. You look at the Paige Bueckers Nike logo. Does this look like they really wanted to do this, or they were just catering to that crowd? So they said, oh, let's just get up Paige and let's give her a logo. Let's cater to the crowd.
What if the problem was never the athlete, but the companies claiming to believe in her? Because the more you look at how Paige Bueckers has been marketed, the harder it is to ignore a growing conversation online. This doesn't feel like real investment. It feels like obligation, like boxes being checked instead of a star being built. For years, fans were told Paige was the next face of women's basketball, the future, the safe bet. Major brands lined up. Headlines followed.
Wasted. You look at the Paige Bueckers Nike logo. Does this look like they really wanted to do this, or they were just catering to that crowd? So they said, oh, let's just get up Paige and let's give her a logo. Let's cater to the crowd. PB. Paint bucket. This looks like a paint can. This doesn't look like they're all in on Paige. This looks like they threw something together just to appease the slows. Fair enough. You look at Caitlin Clark, the Wilson basketball, selling like hotcakes. The Kobe PEs, selling like hotcakes. The Barbie, selling like hotcakes. The action.
But when the dust settled, critics started asking an uncomfortable question. If these companies were truly all in, why does everything around her feel rushed, generic, and oddly disconnected? Take a step back and look at the pattern. Signature branding that feels unfinished. Partnerships that look big on paper but struggle to connect in the real world. Campaigns that exist more as announcements than moments. None of this means Paige lacks talent. That's not the debate. The debate is whether the corporations backing her ever treated her like a priority or simply a convenient choice. Online, some fans argue this was never about building Paige into a cultural icon. It was about optics, about appeasing certain audiences, about saying the right things while quietly doing the bare minimum. And when you compare how other athletes are marketed, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't a hit piece, it's an examination. Because when resources are poured in without intention, the athlete pays the price. Momentum stalls, identity blurs, and instead of organic growth, you get something that feels forced. So how did we get here? Why do the numbers, the branding, and the reception tell a very different story than the hype? Once you follow the money and the effort, it becomes clear this situation says far more about corporate strategy than it does about Paige Bueckers herself. The first real red flag, according to critics, came the moment Paige's Nike branding was revealed. On paper, it was supposed to be monumental. A signature athlete aligning with one of the most powerful brands in sports should feel intentional, creative, and unmistakably personal. But when the logo dropped, the reaction wasn't excitement, it was confusion. Fans didn't see a story, they didn't see vision, they saw something that felt rushed. The logo itself became the center of the criticism. Simple, flat, uninspired. Online discussions quickly labeled it the paint bucket, not as a joke, but as a reflection of how little thought appeared to go into it. Compared to the layered symbolism Nike usually gives athletes it truly believes in, this felt like a placeholder rather than a statement. That's where the frustration grew. Because Nike knows how to build icons, the blueprint already exists. When the company believes in an athlete, the branding shows depth. You see cultural references, you see personality, you see risk. With Paige, critics argue none of that was there. It looked more like something pushed out quickly to say, "Here, we did it," rather than something crafted to last. Some fans believe this wasn't accidental. Reports and online speculation suggest Nike was more interested in appearing aligned than actually investing long-term. The branding felt like appeasement, not belief. A move designed to satisfy a narrative instead of creating one. And that distinction matters. Because branding isn't just aesthetics, it's signaling. It tells consumers who the company is betting on. When that signal feels half-hearted, it subtly tells the market the athlete isn't a true priority. That perception sticks, even if it's never said out loud. What made the situation worse was the timing. This was supposed to be Paige's launch moment. Instead of elevating her, the branding sparked debate about whether she was ever being positioned as a centerpiece at all. And critics are careful to make one thing clear: this isn't about Paige's talent, it's about how a corporation chose to represent her. A weak rollout doesn't just fail to help, it can actively stall momentum. Nike didn't just miss an opportunity here. According to many fans, it exposed a deeper issue. When companies invest without conviction, the athlete becomes collateral damage. And once that perception takes hold, it's hard to shake, no matter how good you are on the court. What made the Nike situation even harder to ignore was what was happening everywhere else at the exact same time. While Paige's branding rollout struggled to generate excitement, the market was loudly responding to other athletes in ways that were impossible to dismiss. Look at what was actually selling. Wilson basketballs tied to Caitlin Clark were flying off shelves. Kobe-branded releases were selling out instantly. Barbie collaborations, action figures, Funko Pops, jerseys, and t-shirts connected to certain athletes weren't just doing well, they were moving at a pace brands dream about. That wasn't hype created by press releases. That was consumers voting with their wallets. And that's where the disconnect became obvious. Because companies love to talk about growing the game, but growth only works when it aligns with demand. You can't force interest and expect it to behave like organic popularity. Yet critics argue that's exactly what was happening with Paige. Instead of responding to what the audience was clearly gravitating toward, brands appeared determined to push a parallel narrative, one that didn't naturally match consumer behavior. This wasn't subtle. Fans began asking uncomfortable questions. If one athlete's merchandise is consistently selling out across multiple platforms and price points, why divert massive resources elsewhere? Why pour marketing dollars into projects that struggle to resonate when the blueprint for success is right there? That's where accusations of wasted resources started gaining traction. Not because Paige lacks value, but because the investment strategy around her felt disconnected from reality. Companies weren't following momentum, they were trying to manufacture it. And when manufacturing replaces authenticity, audiences tend to push back. What makes this especially risky is that it doesn't just hurt sales numbers, it affects perception. When fans see brands ignoring obvious demand, it creates distrust. When they see athletes being promoted without organic backing, it creates skepticism. And once that skepticism sets in, every new partnership is questioned before it even launches. This is where the criticism shifts away from Paige entirely and lands squarely on corporate decision-makers. Because athletes don't choose how they're packaged, they don't choose whether a rollout feels inspired or rushed. That's on the brand. And when that execution fails, the athlete carries the backlash anyway. The market was speaking clearly. The problem, critics say, is that some companies weren't listening. And that refusal to listen would soon show up in places far more visible than just merchandise shelves. Just when the criticism around branding seemed like it couldn't get more confusing, another announcement dropped, and instead of changing the narrative, it amplified the doubts. Paige's partnership with Lego was framed as a massive win, a sign that she was being positioned as a crossover star beyond basketball. But almost immediately, fans started asking the same uncomfortable question. Who is this actually for? Lego is a brand built on instant recognition. Kids know it, parents trust it. When Lego collaborates with an athlete, the face on the box needs to spark immediate familiarity, and that's where the disconnect hit hard. Critics weren't questioning Lego's reach. They were questioning whether Paige's name carried enough recognition yet to justify that kind of partnership. Walk into a Target or Walmart toy aisle. A child sees a box. A parent sees a price tag. The decision happens in seconds. If that face doesn't register instantly, the product sits. That's not opinion, that's retail reality. And fans noticed something troubling. The Lego collaboration felt eerily similar to the Nike logo rollout. Safe, minimal effort, little storytelling, almost like a brand checking a box rather than launching a moment. Instead of building Paige's identity in a way kids could latch onto, the product seemed to assume recognition that hadn't been fully earned in the mainstream market. That assumption is dangerous, because when companies skip the groundwork and jump straight to star treatment, it can backfire. Instead of elevating the athlete, it exposes how fragile the awareness actually is. Critics argue this deal didn't expand Paige's audience, it confused it. What made the situation worse was timing. This wasn't Paige entering the league as a dominant pro already flooding highlight reels. This was a transition moment, a stage where momentum needed nurturing, not shortcuts. And yet the partnership suggested brands were more interested in optics than outcomes. Some fans went even further, suggesting this was another example of performative investment, a big-name company aligning publicly without committing creatively. The collaboration existed, but the passion didn't feel real. Again, the frustration wasn't aimed at Paige. It was aimed at the pattern. Nike, Lego, big announcements followed by underwhelming execution. Each move looked impressive on paper, but hollow in practice. And with every rollout that missed the mark, the gap between corporate narrative and public response widened. Instead of building anticipation, these deals fueled skepticism. And once fans start questioning why an athlete is being pushed instead of pulled by demand, the entire strategy starts to unravel. As the branding questions piled up, a harsher accusation started gaining traction online, that Paige wasn't rising naturally, she was being pushed. And that distinction changed how people interpreted everything around her. Fans began pointing to the media machine behind the scenes: ESPN segments, WNBA coverage, endless comparisons, the same talking points repeated over and over, framing Paige as an inevitable superstar rather than letting the audience arrive at that conclusion on its own. To some viewers, it didn't feel like storytelling, it felt like instruction. And audiences don't like being instructed on who to care about. Organic stars pull attention without effort. Their highlights circulate before networks ask for them. Their jerseys sell before campaigns launch. Manufactured momentum works the opposite way. It relies on repetition, forced comparisons, and constant reminders that this matters, even when the public response doesn't fully agree. That's where the backlash started. Instead of curiosity, people felt fatigue. Instead of excitement, skepticism. The more Paige was positioned as a co-equal to players with undeniable market traction, the more uncomfortable the comparison became. Not because Paige lacked skill, but because the gap in organic demand was impossible to ignore. Critics argue this strategy actually hurt her. By pushing the narrative too aggressively, brands and media created unrealistic expectations. Every game, every product launch, every appearance became a referendum. If it didn't dominate headlines or sell out instantly, it was labeled a failure, even when it shouldn't have been. That pressure doesn't build stars, it distorts them. What made this worse was the constant effort to tie Paige to someone else's momentum. Instead of letting her identity breathe, marketing leaned on proximity. If one name was trending, Paige's name was placed nearby, over and over. The message became clear. Attention wasn't being earned, it was being borrowed. And borrowing attention is risky. Because once the borrowed spotlight moves on, what's left has to stand on its own. If the foundation isn't strong, the drop feels sudden and brutal. Fans sense that instability, even if they can't articulate it right away. This is where the term manufactured motion started sticking. Not as an insult to Paige, but as an indictment of the system around her. A system more focused on optics than outcomes, on appearances rather than patience, on pushing narratives instead of cultivating belief. And once the audience decides something is being forced, regaining trust becomes an uphill battle, no matter how talented the athlete truly is. Eventually, the debate stopped being about opinions and started being about numbers, because ratings don't care about narratives. They don't respond to branding decks or press releases. They simply reflect who people actually choose to watch. And that's where the story became impossible to spin. Paige's WNBA debut drew roughly 639,000 viewers, airing on Iron, a network many casual fans barely associate with live basketball. On its own, that number isn't disastrous. For most rookies, it would be perfectly respectable. But context is everything, and the context here was brutal. Because Caitlin Clark's WNBA debut pulled 2.12 million viewers on ESPN. That wasn't a marginal difference, that was a canyon. The network placement told its own story. ESPN didn't try Clark out, they built around her immediately: prime slot, maximum exposure, full confidence. Meanwhile, Paige's debut felt like a test run, almost experimental, despite months of being marketed as a future face of the league. And here's the part that really shifted the conversation. Even when Clark later appeared on Iron, a channel not known for sports dominance, she still pulled over 700,000 viewers. That's more than Paige's debut, even before Iron gained traction with WNBA audiences. Same platform, same league, different pull. That's when critics stopped arguing and started pointing. Because if one player moves numbers regardless of platform, while another struggles even with heavy promotion, the issue isn't exposure, it's demand. The trend continued. Paige's NBA TV appearance with the Wings against the Liberty drew around 260,000 viewers. Meanwhile, Clark's NBA TV games the previous year consistently hovered between 500,000 and 700,000, sometimes higher. Those weren't one-off spikes, they were patterns. This wasn't about hatting, it was about acknowledging reality. And reality suggested that corporate enthusiasm wasn't translating into public engagement. The audience wasn't rejecting Paige, they just weren't responding at the level brands seemed to expect. That mismatch created a dangerous gap between perception and performance. When companies bet big on an athlete, the numbers are supposed to follow. When they don't, it forces uncomfortable questions, not about talent, but about strategy. And at this point, the numbers weren't whispering anymore, they were saying it out loud. At this point, the conversation shifted in a way that should make every brand nervous. Because once fans stop debating talent and start questioning why someone is being pushed so hard, the narrative turns toxic, not just for the company, but for the athlete caught in the middle. That's exactly what began happening here. The criticism wasn't that Paige couldn't play. Almost everyone agrees she's elite on the court. The problem was that the machine around her wouldn't let her exist naturally. Every rollout, every comparison, every headline felt preloaded with expectations she didn't ask for and didn't control. And audiences felt it. Instead of letting Paige build her own lane, marketing efforts kept trying to fast-track her into conversations she hadn't organically entered yet. That's when fans started using words like forced and manufactured, not as throwaway insults, but as descriptions of a system trying to skip steps. The danger with that approach is subtle but severe. When a player is allowed to grow naturally, early struggles are seen as part of the journey. When a player is marketed as a finished product from day one, every shortcoming becomes evidence of failure. The grace disappears, the patience vanishes, and suddenly, the athlete is being judged against a version of themselves that never actually existed. That pressure doesn't create stars, it suffocates them. Worse, it can alienate neutral fans. People don't like being told who matters, they want to discover it. When discovery is replaced with insistence, resistance follows. That's how skepticism turns into backlash, even when the athlete did nothing wrong. This is where critics argue the real damage was done. By overextending too early, brands unintentionally positioned Paige as a symbol rather than a person. Every underperforming product, every lukewarm rating, every quiet arena became ammunition, not against the companies, but against her. And that's the unfair part. Because Paige didn't design the logo, she didn't choose the rollout strategy, she didn't decide which network aired her debut or how aggressively she'd be marketed. Yet she's the one absorbing the consequences of those decisions. Instead of being allowed to build belief step by step, she was placed on a pedestal that wasn't finished, and then criticized when it wobbled. At that point, the conversation stopped being about missed opportunities. It became about whether the system around her was actively making things harder than they ever needed to be. As the backlash grew, a deeper and far more uncomfortable conversation started bubbling up, one that goes beyond Paige, beyond Nike, beyond Lego. Fans began questioning whether these companies were actually trying to build stars or simply checking boxes. That accusation hit hard. Because once people believe an athlete is being promoted to satisfy optics rather than market reality, every endorsement becomes suspect. Every rollout feels performative. Every partnership looks less like belief and more like obligation. And that's the space Paige was increasingly being pushed into through no fault of her own. Critics argued that this wasn't about basketball anymore. It was about corporations wanting the appearance of inclusivity, progress, and alignment without doing the harder work of building something authentic. Instead of asking, how do we make Paige resonate with the widest audience possible, the approach felt more like, how do we show we supported Paige? That difference matters. Real investment is patient, it's detailed, it's creative, it takes risks and accepts slow growth. Box checking is rushed. It prioritizes announcements over execution. It celebrates the partnership more than the athlete, and once fans sense that imbalance, trust erodes fast. This is why the criticism became sharper. The Nike logo didn't feel unfinished, it felt indifferent. The Lego set didn't feel imaginative, it felt symbolic. The media coverage didn't feel earned, it felt instructed. Piece by piece, a pattern formed that suggested Paige wasn't being nurtured as a long-term icon, but positioned as proof of concept. And that's a dangerous position for any athlete. Because when corporate goals shift, so does support. If engagement dips or narratives change, box-checked athletes are the first to be quietly sidelined. The commitment was never deep enough to survive turbulence. Fans didn't see brands protecting Paige from unrealistic expectations. They saw brands placing her directly in their path. That's why some of the harshest critiques weren't emotional, they were cynical. People started saying Paige was being set up, not elevated, that she was being placed into roles she hadn't been given time to grow into, then judged when the response didn't match the hype. Again, the blame wasn't on Paige. It was on a system that prioritizes optics over outcomes. And once that realization sets in, the entire conversation shifts. It's no longer about whether Paige can be a star. It becomes about whether the institutions around her ever truly wanted to help her become one, or just wanted to say they did. The final consequence of all this wasn't outrage. It wasn't debate. It was something far worse for brands and leagues trying to grow attention: apathy. Once fans decide a narrative is being forced, they don't always argue against it. They disengage, they stop clicking, they stop watching, they stop caring enough to push back, and that's exactly what critics say started happening here. You could see it in the empty seats. You could see it in the muted reactions online. You could see it in how certain announcements landed with a dull thud instead of excitement. Naming Paige as the face of new initiatives didn't spark curiosity, it sparked indifference. And indifference is the hardest thing to reverse. This is where the strategy fully collapsed. Because attention is currency, and attention only flows where people feel something: joy, curiosity, tension, inspiration. When audiences sense that emotion is being engineered instead of earned, they shut it off like background noise. That's not Paige's failure, That's a marketing failure. What made this especially damaging is that Paige never needed this approach. She needed patience. She needed time. She needed space to become familiar to casual fans without being shoved into center stage prematurely. Instead, the system tried to skip the middle chapters and jump straight to the ending. And the audience noticed the missing pages. At that point, even well-intentioned moves started feeling hollow. New partnerships didn't excite. New headlines didn't land. Each attempt to reignite momentum only reinforced the perception that momentum wasn't there to begin with. That's when the conversation quietly changed. People stopped asking, "Is Paige the next face of the league?" They started asking, "Why are they trying so hard to make this happen?" That question alone is devastating for any brand narrative. Because stars don't require explanation, they don't need justification. They simply pull attention by existing. When the marketing becomes louder than the response, it exposes the imbalance immediately. And again, Paige was stuck in the middle. A talented athlete navigating a landscape where the very institutions meant to elevate her were unintentionally draining the room around her. Not by malice, but by impatience, optics, and a refusal to let growth happen naturally. At that stage, the damage wasn't about numbers or logos anymore. It was about trust. And once trust is gone, no amount of money, branding, or announcements can buy it back overnight. At the end of all this noise, one truth stands out clearly: Paige was never the problem. The real failure came from the systems around her that tried to shortcut credibility instead of earning it. When brands prioritize optics over patience, announcements over execution, and narratives over reality, they don't create stars, they create resistance. Paige deserved time, thoughtful branding, and authentic storytelling. What she got instead was rushed symbolism, forced comparisons, and expectations that outpaced organic demand. That imbalance didn't elevate her, it boxed her in. And once audiences sensed that disconnect, trust faded fast. This wasn't about talent, it wasn't about effort, it was about corporate impatience and performative commitment masquerading as belief. Paige wasn't lifted into superstardom, she was pushed toward it before the ground was ready. If there's a lesson here, it's simple. Stars aren't manufactured by money or media pressure. They're built through authenticity, timing, and respect for the audience. Until companies relearn that, this cycle will keep repeating at the expense of the very athletes they claim to support.